September 11th, 2001 changed everything. But here's what most people don't talk about: the choice to ensure those lessons don't get lost with time. Chris Meek didn't just remember 9/11, he built something to make sure the next generation never forgets. The 9/11 Legacy Foundation isn't a museum, it's not a memorial, it's about agency. Teaching young people that when the moment comes, you have the power to step forward and act. Before this foundation, Chris spent 16 years on Wall Street as an equity derivatives trader. He earned his doctorate, wrote best-selling books, became chief marketing officer at Tuttle Capital Management, even ran for Congress. But when you strip away all the titles and ask him what's really true: husband, father, patriot, and now founder of an organization ensuring that memory, responsibility, and lessons of 9/11 aren't lost to time. Welcome to Voice for Valor. Today's guest isn't defined by a single lane, and that is exactly the point. Chris Meek has spent nearly 16 years inside Wall Street as an equity derivatives trader, operated at the highest levels of asset management, and helped shape how global institutions think about markets and risk. He's led at firms like State Street and S&P Global, and today serves as Chief Marketing Officer at Tuttle Capital Management, a firm known for challenging traditional financial narratives. But that is only part of the story. Chris also stepped into the public arena, running for Congress when staying private would have been easier. During a non-compete, instead of waiting, he went back to school and earned his doctorate, not to collect another credential, but to reframe how he thought about leadership and impact. He's a storyteller and a listener, hosting Next Steps Forward, and more recently, a meaning-driven founder, launching the 9/11 Legacy Foundation to ensure memory, responsibility, and lessons aren't lost with time. The common thread here isn't finance, it's agency. The choice to step forward again and again when staying safe would have been simpler. That's why he belongs on today's show, Voice for Valor. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here, and Happy New Year, sir.
Happy New Year to you as well. And before we start, I just wanted to say, as I was looking over your resume, my goodness, an author and all these things you have done, I wanted to start off with, hey, if someone stripped away your titles, Goldman, S&P, Tuttle, doctor, what would still be true about you?
I think three simple answers to that are husband, father, and patriot. It's pretty black and white. It's the DNA, and it's who you are. And so you rise to those occasions in terms of what you're made of and what you're built of. And, blessed to have a terrific bride. Excuse me. We've got three beautiful children, and, I guess sort of became a patriot without really knowing it. And it just sort of kind of evolved over the last, almost 20 years, as you mentioned.
So was there a moment early in your career when you realized finance would give you power, but not necessarily meaning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, originally went to school to be an aerospace engineer, and, grew up learning how to sailboat, racing sailboats in upstate New York, and fell in love with the America's Cup. It's, the biggest thing. It's like the Super Bowl for sailboats, and thought, I want to design the next America's Cup winning boat, and went to college and realized not really cut out to be an aerospace engineer. So kind of thought, where's my real passion? Where are my interests? And became a dual major in both economics and political science. So not real deep finance, but more on the policy side and sort of that macro thinking of it. But then as I went to graduate college, I thought, well, am I going to Washington or Wall Street? And, had massive student loans. And so the answer was quite simple. I had to pay back those loans. And so, found my calling to Wall Street.
So, you said to pay back those loans. You spent nearly 16 years trading derivatives, high stakes, high pressure. What did that environment teach you about human behavior under stress?
Don't ever let them see you sweat. It's just like the old commercial says. There were a lot of situations like that. There's about 3 or 4 specific ones I remember during different, we'll call them financial events. Certainly the financial crisis, the attacks of 9/11, a few other, global scenarios that came into play. And the products that I traded, basically traded 24 hours a day almost, about 20 hours really. And so you would every now and again, get that random phone call from Tokyo or Hong Kong overnight where something was happening and you had to step in. I live in Connecticut, and so was up at 4 o'clock every day on the 5 o'clock train at my desk at 6:15 and started trading at 7. And so you just sort of got into that routine. You knew what you had to do. You'd read and see what's happening in the markets overnight. You'd look and see what sort of policy was going to affect the markets that day, whether it was US or something in Asia or Europe. And so, looking back at my academic beginnings in my undergraduate career, having that dual major in economics and political science really enabled me, I think, to survive and thrive in that trading environment, because having that dual major allowed me to understand what was happening on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, as well as the front page of the Washington Post. And post-financial crisis, and today more than ever, Wall Street and K Street in Washington intersect, more than they've ever done before. And so having that policy understanding as well as the real world economic understanding I think has led me to the places I've been in my career.
Some of our not guests, but listeners, most of them are veterans, but a lot of them are not, politically savvy or, financially, they don't necessarily have that background. Can you explain what derivatives actually are?
Sure. Derivatives, it's a fancy word. It's all it is. And a derivative is an investment that is derived from something else. And so what I mean by that is I trade exchange traded funds, or I used to, excuse me. And so an exchange trade fund trades like a stock. So it trades like Apple or Google or Tesla. But it's a security that holds a bunch of other securities within it. So it's one specific investment, but it'll have 15 other securities within it. So it's like a wrapper, if you will. And so you'll have a fraction of a share of each one of these other companies. And so you can have an exchange trade fund that could have a little bit of Apple, a little bit of Amazon, a little bit of General Motors, a little bit of ExxonMobil, whatever it may be. And so that's what a derivative is. It's just a product that's derived of something else.
Okay. So, we've obviously had multiple business cycle financial crises throughout our history in the US, but what's something Wall Street gets wrong about risk? Not financial risk, but human risk.
It's a great question. And I wish you'd asked me that before so I could prep a little bit.
I
It's,
don't like
I
guys
would
to
say,
prep. I just want
no,
to
I
I want to
know.
keep it real.
I, no, I hear that. Human nature is fear. Everyone works hard for their money and everyone's afraid of losing their money. And so most people don't invest. They'll stick it under their mattress. They'll keep it in the savings account. And also what Wall Street gets wrong is that I forget the exact number, but it's over 95% of the United States population has less than one paycheck in the bank.
Scary.
And it's beyond scary. So you think about the COVID crisis. People were out of work, people were furloughed, people were laid off. And so, the government stepped in and you had a certain amount of pay from that. But still, how do people survive? Wall Street survives because they make money off of other people. That's their job. And what they get wrong is they think they know what's best for individuals. And they tell people what's best for individuals. They don't listen. And there's an old saying that we've heard a lot of people much wiser than me, say that God gave you, 2 ears and one mouth. And so keep your mouth shut and your ears open and listen.
So when you say that, boy, it brings up so many things, and not to go down this, this political rabbit hole, but, right now with the affordable, or not the Affordable Care Act, but, Obamacare, whatever you want to call it, with these premiums going up, and I'm not here to say who's right or wrong, but these people that are living, possibly a savings of one paycheck, that's a big bump in their human risk.
It's a huge bump, and it's something that people don't plan for because you're not aware of it. You don't think about it, and then all of a sudden, boom, there it is. My daughter, who's 22 years old, and she just graduated from college last year, and she's in her first job. Just last night, she came home and said to me how her car wash went from $25 to $35. So she's learning inflation real time just from a simple car wash, and that's a 35-40% increase in one shot. So it's only $10. But when you do that percentage wise, and when it's, only $10 is meaningful to folks when it could be, that is, a pound of deli meat or a dozen eggs and a half a gallon of milk. I mean, it's food inflation itself is through the roof. But then when you layer things on top of it, like, as you mentioned, health insurance or the car wash or whatever it may be, all of these things add up and wages are not keeping up with the rest of consumer inflation. And that's the real driver here.
So excited to have this conversation with you. Last week, I took my two boys, DC area, Five Guys Burgers. It's just kind of a, it's a, it's a very popular.
I've got one 2 miles down the house
There
from
you
me.
go. So we're at Five Guys, and I'm trying to teach my kids, some financial education. So we go in there and three burgers, and we shared fries. And they said, "Dad, can we get a Coke?" I was like, "Guys, we live 2 miles from the house. You can drink a Coke when you get home." But then I showed them the bill. Three burgers and fries was $52. Right. And so I keep telling
Okay.
them, okay, let's talk about minimum wage. Let's talk about taxes. So how much did that $52, burgers really cost? I was like, hey, I'm in this certain tax bracket. And so in reality, that's almost $100 meal when you calculate all those differences. So yeah, I mean, this food inflation, it's the real deal. So
To your point, you went out for burgers and it's costing you $50.
yeah, it's just
It's
it's
just
shocking.
burgers.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, and
It's unfortunate.
yeah, I mean, there's no, you're not going to a restaurant, sitting down, having a server. You're just walking in, having burgers with your kids, and it's $52. I can't even imagine what it costs in Connecticut where you live, or New York City. It's probably another 25% higher. But my point being, my goodness, it's expensive. Your 22-year-old daughter is really getting a lesson in what the inflation is doing to us. So,
Yep.
where was that moment when you knew you couldn't stay there forever? Okay, the derivatives, I got this. When was that moment when you said it's time to do something different?
So I'll take a backstory for you first. So, excuse me, sorry, I'm fighting the cold here. I'm an only child raised by a single mom, and my mother was a deaf education teacher in a small town in upstate New York. And you think back 40 years ago, special education, was a different animal back then. They didn't, children, the teachers, and the parents didn't have the resources available to them that they have today. And I grew up with twin beds, and it took me a long time to figure out why I had twin beds. And because they would lump all the kids with special needs into mainstreaming classrooms, my mother would have kids throughout the different spectrums and different ages from 6 to age 19, 20 years old. And they would, on any given day, a student would come in and would be suffering from mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And she would take that student and say, you know what, you're going to come home with us. We'll give you a hot meal in the warm bed and we'll go see the superintendent, figure it out tomorrow. Now, obviously, you can never do that in today's world. You'd get sued and all that stuff. But, I was sort of I learned very early on that you step in when you can and not when you have to. And, she always had this phrase of, we might not be able to change the world today, but we can change the world around us. And so that's something that really stuck with me at, probably age 10, 11, 12, and was maybe buried away in me and sort of forgot about it. And then fast forward 20 so years later, the financial crisis hit 2008, 2009. And what happened then was that banks were basically giving loans to people that couldn't afford the mortgage. And so people started losing their homes, banks were foreclosing on them. And I thought, well, you know, banks don't want to take these properties onto their balance sheet and the homeowners don't want to lose their home. So why can't we put the banks and the borrowers together and have them figure it out? Because back then, 20 years ago, people still use fax machines. And so people were sending in their applications asking for their forbearance, but they were getting all stacked up. And then the applications were getting mixed together with other applications and just kind of getting lost in the shuffle. And I simply said to a colleague of mine, I said, why can't we just put the banks and the borrowers together in a room? And he said, Chris, I'll bet you a beer you can't do it. And so it was just literally a simple beer bet. And so at the time, Goldman Sachs, where I was working, was not viewed very favorably by the general public. And I thought, well, how can we do this? And so I reached out to a local community center where I live here in Connecticut, asking if we could use their space and was trying to figure out how do we reach out to these banks? My Chris Meek from Goldman Sachs, my Chris Meek from Connecticut, what's it going to be? And so I decided to be Chris Meek from Goldman Sachs to show my, financial experience. And long story short, it was a Saturday morning in April here in Connecticut where we had half a dozen banks. There were some regional, a couple of the major banks like Bank, Bank of America, and JP Morgan Chase all showed up at the community center. And 33 people walked out that day avoiding foreclosure. And I thought, okay, mission accomplished. My buddy Duffy's his last name. He owes me a beer, and we move on. And so it had to be a slow news day that day in Stamford, Connecticut, because the Sunday newspaper, the lead article above the fold was 33 homeowners avoid foreclosure and save their home. So on Monday, the reporter who covered the event, she called me and she said, Chris, when's your next event? And I said, Elizabeth, what the hell are you talking about? It was a one-shot deal just to prove Duffy I could do it and win the beer from him. And she said, well, I've received over 100 phone calls. And so that's when I saw the real need for this. So, long story longer, created my first nonprofit called Start Now. Over the course of the next year, we had 11 events through the state of Connecticut where over 250 families avoided foreclosure. After the sixth or seventh event, the Connecticut State of Banking started attending our events. And eventually, the then governor of Connecticut announced a program where he was going to put banks and borrowers together through a new program where they could avoid foreclosure. And so basically, stole my playbook. And I said, okay, that's fine. I'll move on to something else. And so that was my first entry into the nonprofit space.
Seems to me like your mom's North Star, your guiding principle, you applied some of those practices that you saw as a young boy. The financial world, I mean, it's cutthroat, and like you said, they do have a very negative image in, the general public's view. For instance, my brother worked at Goldman Sachs. You guys have very similar backgrounds. During the 2008 financial crisis, I had my Series 7 like you did. I had my Series 55, so I was doing a lot of financial related things, and I was done. I was on unemployment. It was a really, really tough time. So it's amazing that you had that background growing up, and you kinda went back to that. And so I guess it's kinda like you created the blueprint to allow these banks to have these relationships to save a lot of these homes because that financial crisis could have been much worse.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, look, I'm just one guy in a small town in Connecticut, and it was a very small blueprint. But if you can help one family, great. We were fortunate enough to help 250 families. So all it takes is a little elbow grease and thinking outside the box and having some like-minded friends that want to help and volunteer their time on a Saturday and, go to Staples and get some clipboards and pens and get some organization. And it's not a heavy lift, and at the end of the day, I remember coming home the first time and again, my buddy Duffy, who's since passed, he's like, go get a bottle of wine, pour yourself a big glass of wine, and start writing some thank you notes to the people at the community center and the banks, and just job well done, and thank everybody. And it was just as simple, something as simple as that, and that's led to 20 years into the nonprofit space.
That conversation, did that experience, the beer with Duffy, being on the local newspaper in Connecticut, is that where this whole congressional mindset came from? So you ran for Congress, which is a very public form of vulnerability. What surprised you most about yourself during that campaign?
So I was asked to run for Congress because of that. It literally actually got national attention. Someone sent me a link. I think it was the Monday or Tuesday after the first event we had here in Connecticut. It was the London Telegraph in London, England. And there was an article about the United States economy. And there was a picture of President Obama holding straws. And I remember the title of the article was US is grasping at straw. And there's President Obama. And then underneath it, the article was about me and the event that we'd had. So all of a sudden there's President Obama. And then there's an article about, Chris Meek and this little foreclosure event in Connecticut. And so somehow that got picked up in Washington. They'd reached out to me and had always had an interest just in politics in general. I remember writing a letter to President Reagan when I was 10 years old about my concern about nuclear war with Russia. I actually still have that letter in my home safe, and I think that was the original laser jet signature back then with President Reagan. But then I thought, well, if I could do this event with just one guy and a handful of friends, and again some Staples clipboards with no federal funding, imagine what I could do to help people with a federal budget, with a broader platform on a bigger stage and a bigger scale. And so just looking at that continuation of public service, but on the bigger stage was really, I think, that shot in the arm that made me think about it and then ultimately, throw my hat in the ring.
Now you're forcing me to go off track here, and we'll get back to my next follow-on question. But your letter that you wrote to Reagan about nuclear war, I do a lot of writing. I make fun of the left, I make fun of the right, and then I try to bring everybody in the middle to explain, hey, 95% of us are actually in the middle, but all this tribalism that's going on right now. So a friend of mine posted this thing about how General Milley should be, you know, charged with treason and all this stuff. And I said, I actually know that guy, and he has the most utmost integrity and has done nothing but wonderful things for the American people. Why would you think somebody like that should be, tried for treason and hanged? And he said, well, Mike, just because you know somebody doesn't give them, free will to betray the president and all this stuff. And I was just like, You're missing the point here. At what point do we say we're here to serve? And do we make mistakes? Sure, we make mistakes. But at the same time, General Milley reaching out to his Chinese counterpart, we do this kind of stuff all the time as senior leaders. That's how you de-escalate situations before they get any worse. So if there's something going on and there's a lot of political rhetoric that's causing an an uprising of these potential conflicts, I I would encourage our senior leaders to call their counterparts. As a senior leader myself, I retired as a colonel. I went to a lot of joint schools, got to meet other senior leaders from other countries. And so, for instance, one of my friends that I developed through school was he was a military officer in Lebanon. So when Lebanon started getting strikes from Israel, I'm reaching out to him saying, "Hey, are you okay? What's going on here? Should I be tried for treason because I reached out to a colleague that I respect and I got to know from my time at joint schools?" I don't know why that piece of the story is not making it to the general public. Anyway, that's just
No,
my
no, I agree, and I'm sorry your listeners not to meet my dog Zeke. So I think UPS is here. So I think that's the post-COVID world that we get to meet everyone's personal lives here in this. I think the first question to your friend would be, what have you done for our country? And whether they serve or not, I don't know. But that would be the first thing I would say is, look, to your point, they're trying to de-escalate the situation in terms of, United States and national security and safety. And so there's nothing wrong with that conversation being had. I absolutely agree with your viewpoint on that.
yeah. Okay, well, once again, I'm just trying to bring everybody back to the middle. Sometimes I come across as this elitist, and I don't mean that because if people knew actually where I came from, they'd realize that I'm just trying to help solve problems similar to you. But back to the political landscape for yourself. Would you encourage capable, ethical people to run for office today, or would you warn them away?
It's another great and tricky question. I encourage it. We need young, smart, eager, energetic people out there. We need new young blood out there. I'm not going to call it the swamp because it's just Washington D.C. and it is what it is. But the one thing I would warn them is it is a blood sport. People ask me how was your campaign and what was your event like, and it's like I've got 10 fingers, 10 toes, and I'm still married, and so that's a huge win for me. But absolutely, that is the ultimate public service you can do in terms of serving your country, whether it's the military or in government. And so I absolutely encourage them to do that.
A lot of people have reached out to me asking me to run for Congress, and I said, "I don't want to because then I would have to pick a side." And so I said, me trying to be somebody that's in the middle, they don't understand how caucus works, right? If you want to be a Democrat or Republican, you typically caucus the majority of your time with them because we do have independents that are in the 535 right now. But, I wanna be able to call a spade a spade. And so I'm more of in the policy world, kinda like you mentioned, where I would rather pick holes or choose arguments from the left and the right and try to get the truth out of everything. So me personally, I can't run because then I'd have to pick a side. So
No, and that's fair. And in today's world, it is just the sides are so vocal. Like you said, there's 95% of us in this bell curve here. I call it 80%. There's 10% here and 10% here that have the bullhorn in the pulpit. So I agree with you on that.
so when you left your time in the finance world, you had to sign a non-compete. And rather than sitting around and reading newspapers or going back to your sailing, your love of sailing, you chose to learn. So what question were you trying to answer with getting that doctorate from University of Southern California?
I apparently get bored easily. Um, a big part of it, honestly, was, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but it goes back to my mother. She was married at a young age, divorced at a young age. She got her bachelor's and master's after having me and becoming divorced, and was on her way to getting her doctorate and finishing her dissertation when she passed her breast cancer. And so a big part of it was really just finishing it for her. Um, but my wife reminds me that I'm not a medical doctor. I can't write a prescription or save a life, so I'm not a real doctor. But also, I just wanted to, being a lifelong learner, just what else can I do? What can we do at the next level? And getting the degree in organizational change and leadership, what can I take from my real world lived experiences in the finance world and then my real world lived experiences in the public sector, excuse me, in the nonprofit world. And similar to that Wall Street Journal and Washington Post, how can I intersect those experiences and then write that next chapter of my life and then teach that next generation of leaders?
And I guess that's where it led you to Tuttle Capital. Is that right? So, you say that Tuttle Capital challenges traditional financial narratives. What truth do you think individual investors still aren't being told?
Well, they're being told, the playbook in terms of how to retire at a certain age. And what they're being told is what Wall Street wants you to hear and how they're going to get paid, not what's best for that individual and that investor. And so, the old narrative is really broken. There are so many more new investment theories, philosophies, and vehicles out there for Mr. and Mrs. Jones in Iowa that they're not aware of it. And Wall Street puts their interests ahead of everyone else's. And so I think that's the truth that's not being told. And my dog should start barking soon. I'm sorry.
Okay. So, it,
We have a contractor here.
sure. Is it safe for me to say that the financial world is almost confusing the general public into dependency? Am I reaching too far on that?
I won't say confusing. Look, I've been in the industry for 30 years, and so I've been very fortunate to be in that industry. Um, Confusing is not the right word, but again, it's they're changing as they see the need to change, not necessarily as their end client might see the need to change. And so they might be telling the client what change they should be doing when it might not necessarily be the right change or the change that's needed at that time, if that makes sense.
So during your I mean, fortunately, you seem to have been successful in that financial world. Where was the transition where you started to really focus on some of the 9/11 stuff and setting up your legacy foundation? Why start a 9/11 foundation now when many people are trying to just move on?
So really the impetus there was so for most of my career, I was, I've been working around ground zero. I was across the street on 9/11. I saw everything from the front row. I saw people jumping because that was the best option that they had. And it took me 17 years to actually go back to ground zero. I finally self-diagnosed myself with PTSD. When I went back, it happened to be 9/11 in 2018. I didn't think about it. That was the day, obviously, of the ceremony. And I couldn't actually get to ground zero because of the blockade and the ceremony. And so wasn't quite finished work for me. And then actually went back in May of last year, 2025 was the first time I went to the memorial and I had to there was a photo interview I had to do. And it was really peace and relief when I went back there. But the real driver for creating the Legacy Foundation was the 20th anniversary, and nothing really happened. Big milestone. It was the heart of COVID. It was political controversy between Trump and Biden, who should or shouldn't be there. And I thought, well, 25th is the next big milestone, and it might be the last one that our generation is around for, and something needs to be done. And just wanted to do something different in terms of the education component to that. In 2022, there were dozens of videos put on TikTok in support of Osama bin Laden's letter to America in 2002, which received over 14 million views. In 2023, Pew Research put a report out that over 1 in 5 Gen Zers ages 18 to 29 have sympathy or empathy towards Osama bin Laden. And so we vowed on September 12th, 2001 to never forget. Yeah, we've got over 100 million Americans that don't know what they're supposed to not forget. And so I'm trying to change that narrative from never forget to we remember.
Is that remembrance an act of grief or responsibility?
Maybe a little bit of both, but it's I think more responsibility. This educational component is a huge piece of it. 2,977 victims were murdered that day. Innocent people, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, children, and they're being swept under the rug. And I tell people as I talk about this, unless you live in the Northeast corridor, nobody really gives a shit about 9/11. You weren't really affected. Even from Boston, where one of the planes took off from Logan, they're not really part of that circle. So it's really New York, DC, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That's it. If you live in Chicago, if you live in Las Vegas, okay, 9/11 is a day on the calendar and that's it. One of my biggest fears is that we make 9/11 Memorial Day and you get 15% off at the mall if you go shopping at Macy's. And that can't happen. And so that's my personal responsibility. That's the weight that I bear on my shoulders as someone who was there. and seeing a woman hold her dress down as she jumped as her last act to try and save some dignity before she jumped to her death.
It brings up so much emotion in me because I don't know how old you are, but I'm 50 years old, and I was a second lieutenant in the Air Force when 9/11 happened, and I was asleep living on the West Coast, and my roommate started banging on the wall, "Mike, Mike, you gotta get up, turn on the television." And we saw all this happen. The strangest thing of all was all of us just put our uniforms on and drove into work. Nobody had to ask us. There was no, text message. Hey, we're going to this DEF CON or we're going to this force protection. You got to come to work. Everybody just showed up. And I remember the colonel at the time standing in front of us, a very large audience at the base I was stationed at. And he was like, "We're fucking going to war, and, America's been attacked." And, yeah, so to hear you say that 14 million views were, you know, in favor of Osama bin Laden, my goodness, we've lost the communication war.
No, and that's an understatement, unfortunately. And as we know, this today's generation, it's just social media. And when you've got TikTok as one of the major platforms, the attention span now I think is like 14 seconds for a video or something to that effect. And so they're just sort of doom scrolling on their phones, and they're going to click that video. It's their, as you mentioned, clickbait, and that's it. And it's unfortunate. I'm blessed that through the work I've done over the last 16 plus years, our kids have seen what I've done, and so their mindset is of a certain way. It's the old phrase of raise them right, teach them young in terms of responsibility and giving back. And so, again, I feel this is my personal cross that I bear.
You mentioned the TikTok thing and these algorithms. I wrote a story about the power of these algorithms, and I tried to give the example of I have two YouTube pages. I've got Voice for Valor and I've got my personal page. My personal page algorithm is built very news centric. It talks about the left, it talks about the right, but I get this constant feed of news. But then my Voice for Valor YouTube page is all just ultra right wing, guns, violence. And I thought, but I'm the same person and I'm getting fed completely different algorithms. And so I just feel so sad for folks that get stuck in these echo chambers and they go from being a critical thinker to just somebody that you can't even have a conversation with, and I don't know how to fix that.
Fortunately, we can't. And to your point, you're being fed what you want to be fed. They've already labeled you a certain person. To your point about your veteran one, and it's just like you said, it's going to be guns, ammo, war, whatever it is. And just because of a certain few buzzwords on there, the chatbots or wherever they are, they find you and they just start feeding you stuff.
Well, before we had this conversation or before preparing to interview you today, I was looking at your 911legacy.org website. You've got some heavy hitters on here. I mean, I remember last year listening to Andrew Card, who was the former chief of staff of George Bush during 9/11. You've got my boss now, General Sasseville, on your website, and then you've got Leon Panetta. You've got some heavy hitters in this organization. So, as you've interviewed leaders across disciplines, what trait consistently separates those who endure from those who fade?
It's very simple, and it's service above self. Every single one of these individuals are true public servants in the absolute purest form. You mentioned Andy Card, Leon Panetta. I'm blessed. I'm interviewing them later today for the podcast for pre-recording. And I've never met two finer gentlemen than these guys, and the careers that they have had are, if they were baseball or football players, they're in the Hall of Fame, first ballot. If there were Mount Rushmore for non-presidents, they'd be on it, and obviously in both different political parties. You mentioned General Sassville, who's just, for people who don't know his story, he was one of the first two planes deployed when 9/11 happened. He'd just come back from a practice flight and was unarmed. He and then Lieutenant Heather Penny, Lucky Penny, their job was to take down Flight 93, and one was to strike the front of the plane, one was to strike the tail of the plane, and it was a suicide mission. And people didn't really know that story until the 10th anniversary. So I want to make sure people know that story. And that's part of what we're doing here is the general public don't know a lot of these stories that's actually happened about heroism, resiliency, duty, service above self. And so heroes like Mark Sassville, Heather Penny, leaders like Andy Card, Leon Pineda, that's what we need our young people today to look for in terms of your Aaron Judge, your Shohei Otani, your whoever your big star is in terms of what you should do and what you should focus on to be that public servant that they are and that they have been. And these gentlemen and women have done 30, 40, 50 years of their career where they could have made a ton of dough in the private sector, but they serve their country above themselves.
I try to tell anybody that's willing to listen. I get on my soapbox. My wife always teases me. She's like, "Here he goes again. He's going to go off this diatribe or this recruiting, this recruiting episode." But I keep telling people it has been proven time and time again, from psychologists to sociologists to you name the profession. Service has proven to provide internal happiness. Service at your church, being a police officer, being a firefighter, serving your community, serving others has been proven that that is what wakes you up in the morning and provides this level of happiness that people are just seeking through TikTok, through these channels that are not designed to make you happy. They're designed to make you miserable so that you continue to consume more content, buy more products, follow more things, and it's sad. I wish there was an
Sad's,
easy answer.
no, sad's the understatement. And my hope is that, when these, I'll call them young kids because I'm a little bit older than you, but, when they're 22, 23, 4 years old, they're still growing, still maturing, especially we know that men mature later than women. But my hope is that once they turn 30 and they become husbands, wives, parents, they realize the world's a little bit different and they have different responsibilities now. And that, to your point, it has been proven time and time again that working at your soup kitchen, delivering meals, being a volunteer for the Boy Scouts or whatever it may be, that's what makes you feel good. That's what makes you get out of bed. And it's something as simple as that. It's not a lot of time. And if you do that, you're going to feel good. You're going to teach your spouse or your neighbors or your children about it as well. And they give back. And so my neighbor, very close friends with them, the wife, she spends most of her time at the local animal shelter. And that's her big thing. And because of her, well, you heard one, but we have two rescue dogs. And so it's just something as simple as that, where you give back your time, you feel good, but it's not just about you feeling good. It's just the right thing to do.
What question do you wish someone would ask you, but rarely does?
Wow. Probably that one.
Yeah.
Oh boy. If you weren't on Wall Street, where would you be? And I'm only saying that because I saw a new podcast is coming out where they asked Charles Barkley if he wasn't 6'10", where would he be? And he says, I'd be at McDonald's asking if you want fries with that.
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty funny. I don't know. I'd probably be like a policy wonk in a think tank. Just sort of, going into that academia world. My wife laughs at the number of pieces of paper I have on the wall. I'm like, they just collect dust. It's more things to dust on Saturday.
I've taken all my certificates and accomplishments off my wall. Now it's just airplanes and motivational.
Much
Mm,
better, much better.
yeah.
Yeah, and maybe a teacher. My mom was a teacher, and I've been an adjunct professor in the past, so maybe that route.
When your career is viewed as a whole, what do you hope connects the chapters?
Parallel lives. Wall Street meets Main Street. And just the giving back component to it. Yes, again, I've been very blessed to have a long, fairly successful career in the financial services industry, but that's afforded me the luxury of being able to do the volunteer work that I've done. That jump started it, obviously, with the foreclosure event. And so just having that ability to navigate those two worlds and to have those parallel lives, I think has really been what's been most fulfilling for me.
For our listeners who feel stuck between comfort and calling, what's the first next step you would challenge them to take?
Go for it. Don't be afraid. Things will work out. You'll figure it out. You might take a step back, but you're going to take 3 steps forward. And so, you mentioned my podcast at the beginning of the show. It's called Next Steps Forward. And it's always about You might get knocked down, but it's about perseverance. It's about resilience. It's about, going forward and learning from your mistakes, and teaching others about that as well. Just like our parents, we're now becoming our parents. Like, don't do it. You're going to learn. And like, damn it, dad was right or mom was right. And so really just go for it. Things will figure themselves out.
One thing that I try to tell folks when I'm asked kind of that next step question, or what can I do today, right? You look at this thing and it looks like a mountain. So what can I do today for that first step? And I was having a conversation with General Swartz, a former chief of staff of the Air Force, and he said, Mike, don't ever be afraid to ask senior leaders or those with more experience than yourself for mentorship, guidance, and coaching. So if church is your thing, go to your deacon, go to whatever religion you're part of, go to those senior leaders and ask for advice. I have asked so many people outside of my normal profession, can I just pick your brain? Can I be a puppy dog and follow you around today and just and see what makes you tick and why you're so successful or you're so happy in the way your life has turned out. And that's the best advice I try to give folks is I reach out to the most random people that that people are like, hey man, you're punching way above your weight trying to have a conversation with that guy or gal. And guess what? 25% of the time they actually respond and they're wonderful people and they like to give back as well. So Chris, I listened to you at the American Veterans Center, the what do we call that? The American Valor, right? So I've been a volunteer photographer for that thing for the last couple of years, and I've gotten to know some wonderful veterans and people that have given back. And I am just so thankful that you are doing this and that you are giving back. And so I just have one little rapid fire for you, and then we'll call it good.
Okay, fair enough.
Power or purpose?
Purpose,
Certainty or curiosity?
curiosity,
Legacy or impact?
impact,
Comfort or growth?
growth.
Brother, Chris, thank you so much for being on Voice for Valor. I look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
That was an absolute honor and a pleasure, Mike. Really, really enjoyed the conversation and hope your viewers and listeners get something out of this. So thank you. It was an honor and thanks for your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Chris.